So we have half an hour for questions. So either if you have a question for one of the speakers or both of them, just feel free to either raise your hand up on the chat function, or just feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or type in a question into the chat box. So there's a few options. So who would like to ask the question first? Kate, over to you.
Hello, so I just got my mute thing going. I'd just like to ask both speakers if, everything you've said, I completely agree with, but I just don't see it in a lot of the leaders I come across. So why do you think there's the gap between what we're saying in theory, what we're saying in business schools? I mean, I teach undergraduate business in a business school, and I'm saying all of these things, and the students are all saying, yes, 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 this is brilliant. But I don't see that in any of my leaders. And we're constantly saying, why have we got such poor leadership when we're saying these are the things they should be doing, these are all the positives, but it never happens?
Wonderful question. And over to you.
Sam, do you want to go first? Or?
Sure, no problem. So Kate, thank you very much for that question. I think, one of the biggest problems is it's often those leaders that are sending their colleagues and their employees to training programs and development programs, and they're not going themselves. And so one of the deals that I make when I design or implement leadership programs for a particular company, if you're not all coming, don't waste my time. Because what happens is I'm going to create a bigger problem for you than started, because I'm going to share these practices with them, and they're going to know what you're doing wrong, and that's going to make them check out and be even more disengaged. The second thing is, I think that in the last 10, 15 years, let's say 2 decades, and this differs across cultures, of course, there's been an awakening about the importance of these practices. And I think the younger generation is much more clued in to what's important and how things need to be done. And so, Kate, the more diversity we have in organizations and the more options and chances we give to people from a different generational level, the more we'll see this. And the final point that I'd like to make about this is, regardless of how the leader is being or how other members of the team are, try and be the example that you would like to see in others. And so if we're always focusing on other people and saying, well, they're not like that, then when are we going to begin being different, right? And so I always sort of advise employees that one day you will be in a position of leadership. And today, what you can do is demonstrate practices that are much more conducive to effective performance. And when you are in a position of leadership, hopefully that will be, much more widespread and then modeled with the rest of the people in the organization.
Yeah, first of all, just thank you to Sam for your talk. I found it really good, really enjoyable talk. But just go on to your question there. The reason why I see that there's that issue when we go into organisations is because, like I said in my talk, we don't provide any sort of leadership training until they're senior leaders. And by that time, there's a lot of stuff there's a lot of bad habits and stuff that's happened. And also echoing a point around, actually, we know that transfer of training, we can go to all these development things, but if the transfer of training requires support from the organisation as long as peers. So we actually need the leadership, their leadership, to be involved in that, just like Sam said, which is vitally important. And another point is that we don't ever seem to challenge our leaders in that sense. We don't really put people through paces to gain how they react in that stressful situation, because it's all great having this theory, but then if the first time you're ever doing it is in a stressful situation, then there's a lot of factors in there that could indicate how you react, and not necessarily by practice. And then the other one is around, we still have this thing around accidental leadership. We're not putting people in leadership positions because they've demonstrated the attributes or skills to be a leader. We've put them in those positions because they've been there for so long and they're really good at their current role they're doing now, or they're just really confident and loud. And we know that actually confidence isn't a predictor for leadership success. So that's sort of key points that I've noticed.
And I think, Michael, if I can just add one final point here to the question that was asked is, you know, what we measure is what gets managed, right? And if we're only measuring sort of how much the company is making, and we're not putting alongside that, if we're not putting performance and positive impact alongside productivity and profitability, so then how are we then ever going to expect leaders to put equal amount of importance on how they perform in their vital skills and in their positive impact as much as profits?
Excellent. Thank you both. Kate, does that answer your question?
Yes, very much. And I think, I totally agree with a lot of that. And the one thing I'd add is I really like the fishbowl metaphor, whereas you say, if you had a poorly goldfish, you wouldn't sort the goldfish out, you'd sort the water out. And I think that's the issue around culture and strategy, is that's all the water and the environment of the fish. Whereas with leadership, we tend to focus too much on the fish and not on the water bowl.
Indeed. It's a good analogy. And now we just give a fish a bit of mental health coach and can think it will all go okay. Thank you for that, Kate. Jeremy, I noticed you have your hand up. Over to you.
Thank you. Both very interesting talks. I think this question is probably more aimed towards Michael, because as you was talking about sort of leadership, and the thing which came into my mind is types of leadership and its relevance in different types of organizations. How well that translates. So, for example, I've reported previously into a CIO. He was ex-military, a colonel of computer, I think he was, and his leadership style was very much fire out the command and expect it to happen. But this was within a conservation charity where actually commands are optional and everything's kind of up for debate and discussion. So he really struggled in his leadership role. So he may have been a fantastic leader in the military, but when he came over to a not-for-profit organization, his leadership style just didn't land at all well, and he really struggled.
Yeah, it's about balance. And I think the thing I struggle with, when people know my background as a soldier, they make automatic assumptions about probably the style that I'm going to present in there, but it's not really true. I think that sort of command style works for Iraq and Afghanistan, because it wasn't never simple, was never simple, but it was a bit more simpler than it then became. But we do have this think about what we're most comfortable with. So what you've done so far is comfortable, but it's really about self-awareness, and actually working on Sam's last comment really is about looking at where your strengths lies, where are you avoiding, and you need to get that balance back, and realizing that one approach isn't necessarily going to suit all. And it's like our communication. We have this thing about that we can communicate one way and everyone's going to understand. That's the same with leadership. It's about understanding balance, and then very much looking at the individual level and how we can best influence, communicate, or lead those people to ensure that we have that alignment gap. We close down the action gap, and that we create that environment that enables others to succeed. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
Yeah, cool.
Nikita, hi. Sorry, can I just add a little bit more to that, if you don't mind? Would that be okay, Nikita?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I was a little bit late. Sorry, so I do apologise. I missed your thing there, Mike. But I'm ex-military too, and just picking up on that really interesting question, because there is a challenge of people coming out of the military because you've got a big cultural background behind you of how things are done, and when you do come into organisations, you really have to. Well, you've got to really release it, and it can be a big thing to do. I found that very challenging,
And I think, good 10 years actually, maybe, you got to ease off. And so I do share that concern or that observation, but it's equally people to support that person as well, because they are moving from quite a disciplined and structured place into something which is more fluid and with different values and a culture. So I'll ease off, but I thought I'll just share that.
Thank you for that, Charles. And I'm just curious to hear also from Sam, considering you're in a business school environment and you could see leaders transitioning from, sure, all sorts of different careers, professions, and life stages. What are your thoughts on this, on adapting different leadership styles across different settings?
Yeah, I think, what's very important is not only the experience that these leaders have built throughout the years, but the awareness of what those skills are and the discourse to be able to talk about them and to describe them. So being in the military, I mean, my goodness, the amount of discipline and the amount of the sort of systematic strategy associated with that military mindset. There are so many incredible transferable skills that could be used in a wide range of different industries. So A, knowing what those skills are, and B, being able to talk about them, being able to say that, these are the skills that I've gained as an athlete, as a member of the military, as a mother, raising 3 kids that I've been out of the workforce for about a year and a half. But look, these are the skills that I've gained as a result of that experience, and that's how I can transfer them to this particular role. I tell you, new mothers are incredibly skilled at time and self-management, but just being able to have the discourse, the language to talk about what those transferable skills makes the difference between people who are able to transition and people who have a little bit more difficulty doing so.
So it is about dialogue about these topics and creating a space to talk about it. Yeah, and for some reason, in a lot of kind of returning to work after maternity or paternity leaves, I feel that you need to be coached, etc., back into the workforce rather than actually valuing the skills you have learned in the last year and a half. I'm always quite surprised by that. Thanks so much, Sam. Okay, so we still have time for 1 or 2 questions. Who'd like to go next?
Hi, Nikita. It's David Tong. Can I go next?
Sure.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, it's still very difficult for leaders to give direction and confidence because there is so much uncertainty around at the moment. And I just wondered whether one, thing that they've got to work with is the kind of time frame, and whether, the speakers think that instead of, we're coming up to budget planning time for 2021 now. Good luck to anyone putting together an annual budget for next year, but whether people should be working sort of more clearly on a quarterly basis and revising their plans and objectives, in a tighter time frame to help them cope with the uncertainty.
So to limit that time of reference.
Yeah.
And revise it more often than not.
Exactly.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'd look at it and think that there's a difference between maybe a sort of myopic approach and just planning. Because first of all, if you look at the knowledge gap, normally you don't want to plan beyond what we don't know. But we still need to have a good intent or a direction that we're going. We keep that quite short. It doesn't give us the opportunity to influence what may happen. You can't really take people somewhere if they don't know where you're trying to get to, as we know that the strategy is a decision-making framework. So that we still need to push out beyond, but by involving everyone involved with that, then, and for the leader to be able to sit back, you can then look at what's happening to see then what's a opportunity of a threat. You can't really do that if you don't know what you're actually trying to strive for in the long term. But by engaging everyone in that process, you then allowing them with the information and the context to adapt and make decisions in line with the intent or vision you've set out within the freedom constraints also that's been imposed on them. So, and I think if we start going too short of a cycle, then we get to that point of going, okay, what's next? And we lose that fluidity that we could have if we've just been a bit bolder and pushed out a bit further. But that's my opinion. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is both are necessary, again, during crisis as well as in normal times. During crisis, it's perhaps even more necessary to maintain that semblance of normalcy. So the fact that regardless of what's going on, we will continue doing our scenario planning, our financial planning, our budgeting planning for the long term. And in fact, now what this pandemic has taught us is why don't we throw in these uncertain and volatile variables in our scenario planning so that we can look at what may happen in the long term. But short term is much more realistic and focusing on so that we're agile with our strategy. Long-term gives them a sense of normalcy and that sense of this too shall pass. And we do need to scenario plan in order to plan, to prepare for what come may.
Absolutely. Strategy and tactics. Yeah. It's just not one or the other. And this is where individual differences come in. Some people are more strategic, some people are more tactical, and some people can do both. So
I think it's a very good point that Sam brought up there about the contingencies and thinking about the what ifs. And it's not thinking about every eventuality, but what you're doing it and doing that from the strategic to the tactical level, because then you're enabling that that ability, that priming people ready, so that when things do change, there isn't that massive cognitive drain or stress to think about what next. We've already started to provide those shortcuts that will work because we've already thought about the contingency, so we can move across. And it's normally quite a conceptual exercise, but it's a very relevant exercise.
Excellent. And yeah, the balance of tactics and strategy is essential. I also recently talked to a researcher who was talking about resilience of teams, and she basically found that the more resilient teams, of course, you need psychological safety and trust, but you also need frequent wash-up sessions. And I find it fascinating, for example, that still a lot of people I talk about haven't had a wash-up session about lockdown. Actually, how are we doing? What did we learn from this experience? They're not even making space for it, which is kind of fascinating, because everybody's like, well, it's post-lockdown, post-COVID. Like, we have no idea when the thing is going to end. And instead of doing this, it's just like, actually, where are we now? As there's a song about that, which is so interesting to explore. And talking about what's interesting to explore, we have time for one more question. Would anybody like to have a go?
I have a question.
Go for it.
Mary, is that okay?
Perfect.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you, Nikita. That's been absolutely really stimulating, very interesting. And my question, I don't know, might be a bit, anyway. Is it possible to expect too much from our leaders and from leadership? And in having such high expectations, potentially, do we then actually cause people to get stuck, if you like, and not to be able to deliver?
Fascinating.
Shall I take this, Michael, to begin with? Thank you. So I think, Mary, thanks for that question. Thank you for your lovely compliments. I think what's really important here is in life, whether in our professional lives or our personal lives, we need to have real expectations. We need to have objective expectations. We need to have, we need to critically analyze and look at, what am I expecting? And is that fair? And so we have these cognitive biases, and unrealistic expectations may be a bias that may interfere with the way that we perceive the functionality and the effectiveness of how someone is doing their job. But you see, how I form my expectations very much depends on what I see and what I hear from the individual that I'm being led by, right? So if I'm, if they are not practicing what they preach, if they don't model the way, if they, say one thing and do another thing, if they make certain commitments and never deliver on those things, your expectations should be fair, objective, balanced, measurable, and identifiable. And if they're not, then perhaps there needs to be more reflection for the self rather than the leader. And, can I also say that I always tell my team, we all have a community responsibility for perspective thinking here when it comes to expectations from leadership. So if one of the my team members comes and sits with me and says, and starts gossiping negatively about our boss, it is my responsibility to also say, hey, do you think what you're saying is fair? Do you think what you're saying is, right? I think, she or he has done a great job, and maybe this was a mistake, but why gossip about them in this way?
Yes. Yes, it comes back to what you said earlier about, in a sense, we're perhaps less concerned fully with outcomes. At least this is what I understood you to say, and more concerned to see that, putting it simply, people are doing their best, the best with what they've got, the information that they have, the skills they have. Thank you. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. And I think when I talked about the narrative that goes into social media, it puts a lot of pressure on leaders, because according to social media, you must have all the answers. And where actually it's not congruent with what we're talking about, because we're talking about, people make mistakes, failures are inevitable, complexity and chaos is all about acting, sensing, and responding the best you can at that time, the information you have available to you. If you look at narrative around social media that has a lot of control on people's thoughts and beliefs at the moment, it says that leaders need to be perfect. Leaders need to have all the answers straight away, and God forbid anyone could make any mistakes. So that really puts a lot of pressure on. If you look at the attributes that I shared earlier, and it goes on what Sam says, that around that tactical humility and that sharing of the context of what's happening, it will mediate the expectations, because people will understand what's happening and they can see the challenges a bit more, and they're more involved in the situation. So those expectations can be tempered a lot easier that way. Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. No, social media, definitely very important. Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And on that note, we're just gonna wrap it up. So if people on this call, if you can just take a couple of seconds to think about what's your key takeaway from today and just pop it into the chat, it'd be really interesting to find out. If you take a few seconds to reflect on our wonderful two speakers, Michael and Sam, not to mention all the wonderful questions and the points you all contribute to in the chat, which always makes this things even more interesting. If you can just pop a few thoughts down in the chat, that'd be lovely. Rob Barnes has a question, point about leadership and D-Day as a case study. Case Grint is the same space that you have been discussing. Are you familiar with that, Michael?
I'm not familiar with that book. I'll go check it out, because I love reading now. But yeah, a lot of it is, I would argue a lot of it is shaped, because 18 years in the British Army, a lot of my thoughts and feelings are going to be shaped by it. But I just think that the military is not what people think it is nowadays. I think we've changed a lot since the complexity of Afghan and Iraq, and there is still that elements in any organisation. But I think it's just garnered this ability and understanding to realise that actually how we need to lead in complexity requires a higher degree of balance between the physical skills of leadership and then the emotional side about connecting with people and how to get the best people out. But without the balance of the two, you're just not going to get there.
Absolutely. Balanced appreciation of order and chaos. Oh, wonderful feedbacks. Actually, also takeaways about orders and chaos as a line of opportunity. There was a wonderful talk by the Netflix CEO, interview by The Economist. You can find it on YouTube. And he says that, you know, if you want to be creative, you need to operate on the edge of chaos. And I thought this is quite interesting. And just as a thought to finish on about the importance of diversity, I feel that right now more than ever, we need diversity. Especially diversity of thought, because if we look at uniformity of thought, it can be productive when you have a predictable environment. You know what you can get alignment, but right now the world is too complex for any individual to manage. So therefore it's all about how we can lead together and facilitate collective intelligence, as Ron Warren says, because the world is too complex for any leader, for even countries can't manage alone anymore. It's all about how we can work together, appreciate everybody's individuality who brings to the table, and actually build something together which could be different. And I found, for example, Sam's point about what gets measured. We talk about KPI and performance, but do we talk about positive emotional impact or anything like that? What's the responsibility of a leader? Which is also quite fascinating. So just as a few final words, Sam and Michael, would you just like to share your final reflections before we close off?
Somebody like you first?
Thank you, Michael. I would say that remember practices and not principles. And it's not necessarily what you know, but it's what you do on a daily basis that separates you from others.
Wonderful, thank you. Michael?
I'd just echo that point. I think it's a fantastic point about, we all talk about behaviours, but actually if we refer to it as practices, it's much better. So that's definitely something I've taken away from that view from Sam. But mine is really about, it is about balance. It's really about being self-aware and balancing the two between the actual emotional disconnect of trying to think of the strategy and organisational capability of building, with the balance with the connecting to the teams and individual level, and making sure you are that, you try to be that exemplar of a leader that people want and require.
Wonderful. To be the change that you want to see in the world, as Gandhi said. I find it's a wonderful way to finish today's session. So thank you again, Sam and Michael, for being wonderful speakers.
For organizing this, and thank you so much for bringing like-minded people together for us to have these discussions. We appreciate you.
Well, thank you very much. Ego needs love too. And on that note, by the way, Sam, Michael, are you happy for people to connect with you on LinkedIn?
Of course, absolutely.
Of course, more than happy to. It'd be great to carry on conversations.
Thank you so much. And on that note about carrying on conversations, the next Reshape event will be on the 15th of October. We have a philosopher, a therapist, an addiction specialist, and several other people joining quite an interesting discussion. So watch this space. And talking about space, we have a Reshape website, and now we also have a Reshape page on LinkedIn. So you can search for that. And on that note, I wish you a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Stay safe and let's practice those wonderful behaviors to make our life and others a little bit better. Thank you very much, everybody.